Good morning. Welcome to Focus on the News. I'm Dick Black, former senator, and today we're joined by really one of the finest foreign intelligence intellectuals that I know. I've known Jim Jatras for many years, and his parents were wonderful, extremely well-informed people before he was. And Jim is a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer. He spent time serving in Mexico and with the Office of Soviet Union Affairs. He's a longtime senior foreign policy advisor to the U.S. Senate Republican leadership. Following many years of government service, he went into the private sector, and he did lobbying and media representation for interests in Russia, Ukraine, Serbia, the Philippines, India, and other countries. And he's a very respected commentator on international and also on U.S. domestic topics, both with U.S. media and also with media from abroad. So with that, Jim, our topic today is the ominous rumblings in Ukraine. And so welcome to the show. It's a great honor to have you here. I just have the utmost respect for you. So we'll let you kick things off at this point.
Well, thank you, Senator, and I thank you for your gracious words. I know that my parents, George and Stella, just thought the world of you. That when they were your constituents out there in I guess Loudoun County, and so it's just it's just a great honor to be with you here today, and I'm sure they would be very pleased looking down on this conversation. Getting to the topic, it seems to me that there are two real big issues going on right now. What are the Russians going to do next, or what are they doing now? And then what does, if you will, our side, the West, do about it? And, as I think was mentioned just beforehand with regard to the Russian intentions, as they say, those that know don't talk, and those that talk don't know. I mean, I think there's probably about 10 or 12 guys in the Kremlin who knows what their next move is, and the rest of us are just watching the tea leaves and the developments on the ground and trying to infer what exactly they have in mind. And there's been a lot of speculation on this. The best thing I've seen was something recently in Moon of Alabama. Bernhard, I guess, is the name of the German guy who runs that. And it showed what, a couple of days ago, what appears to be happening right now, where there will be two, possibly three thrusts that the Russians will make, principally one coming from the south, just to the east of Zaporozhye. I think that the town that immediately across the line of control is a place called Orekhov. And the long and the short of it, it seems that with this whole confrontation over Bakhmut, the Ukrainians have committed the bulk of their remaining forces, which they've been subjecting to horrible attrition over the last few months in a vain attempt to make progress against the Russians and to hold this strategic location. It looks like the Russians are going to be in a position now to advance in areas that the Ukrainians are very thinly spaced, and essentially to trap all those troops in Bakhmut unless they're pulled out very, very promptly. And it doesn't look like they're doing that. We can get in all the details of this, but the long and the short of it seems to me this is that the Russians seem to have a dilemma right now. Do they do something decisively that would deliver a knockout blow to the Ukrainian forces and present the Western powers with a fait accompli, where their proxy in Ukraine has been defeated? Or do they drag out this war of attrition, this what they call slow grind that is destroying the Ukrainian forces while inflicting very little damage comparatively on the Russian forces? And I think what's really at work there is the Russians, I think, don't want to see our side, if you will, do something really, really stupid that causes a direct military conflict between NATO and Russia. that they believe, and I believe as well, would not be limited in terms of escalation. The fear, I think, is not so much that they're afraid, but rather they don't want to see a confrontation that turns into an upward spiral that results in a nuclear exchange, and then, of course, we're all dead. So, and I think their dilemma is, does delivering the knockout blow present a greater danger that we might do something really dumb, or does dragging this thing out create that danger? My guess is they probably have come to the conclusion that the first presents a lesser danger than allowing this thing to drag on. It's pretty clear when we listen, and this gets to the second point now, of what our side is likely to do. If they drag this thing out, and we're talking about sending more armor there, and Leopard tanks or Abrams tanks or whatever else, things that won't arrive for months, it's pretty clear that the Western side would like to drag this out as long as possible into 2024. That seems to me to provide a lot of incentive for the Russians to try to wrap this up now, whatever risk that presents in terms of the Western powers panicking and doing something directly to insert coalition of the willing forces into Ukraine. I think they probably have decided they need to run that risk. I could be wrong, but that's certainly the view I would take if I were in their position, that the longer this thing goes on, the longer, you continue the escalator up into something that the West mistakes Russian restraint for weakness or an indecisiveness, and that their restraint works against them in that respect. So I think they're probably going to do something fairly decisive at this point, and maybe we're already starting to see the beginning of that.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing rumblings on the periphery, and it seems like quite a number of places there are small local advances here and there. Certainly around Zaporizhia down in the south, we do see, actually, I believe TASS has mentioned editorially that there is an advance taking place, and usually, the Russians are interesting. They when things are going poorly, they may not say a whole lot, but they seldom say things that are simply misleading or just blatant propaganda. It's very interesting because it's quite a contrast with the Ukrainians who just simply make things out of thin air, like the ghost of Kiev, the mysterious Ukrainian pilot at the very beginning of the war who had reportedly shot down 40 Russian jets, and he was just being proclaimed all over the Western world as this incredible hero of the Ukrainian Air Force. And it turns out that it wasn't an exaggeration about the exploits of some pilot. It was a total fiction. He did not exist. He was no more than something you'd put in a comic book. And yet it's been very consistent Western policy, U.S. policy, that when we assess the war, we use Ukrainian intelligence sources. And that's what we base it on, which avoids the awkwardness of having this gargantuan U.S. intelligence body do its own assessments and admit that things are rather grim over there. But it appears to me that the mobilization that was conducted just over the last several months has been the Russian mobilization has been enormously successful. They managed to essentially draft 300,000 troops. There were another 80,000 volunteers. And I'm not sure whether that's on top of the people volunteering for the the Wagner Group, which is very much like, it's sort of patterned after the U.S. Blackwater. Mercenaries, but very effective. So now Russia appears poised with a very large, perhaps 100,000 army ready to cross the border from Belarus, headed south to cut off supply lines to Kiev. And then there is another army of 100,000 somewhere in the Zaporozhye or in the Kharkiv area to the east. And then there is another substantial army in the south. And these are really in addition to the frontline forces that have been fighting the war up to this point. That's a lot of force.
That's right, and there may be an element of strategic deception in that. For example, the forces in Belarus that could make a thrust down into Western Ukraine, that might be partly diversionary to force the Ukrainians to type forces there in anticipation of that while they actually make their move farther in the east. Or maybe they make that move later on after they've disposed of the bulk of the Ukrainian forces in the east. I think one thing, I've got a very good friend, Sergei Trifkovich, who is the foreign affairs editor for Chronicles magazine, and he's been convinced that the Russians are making all the same mistakes that the Serbs made in the 1990s during the wars in the Balkans, where they avoided taking advantage of their military potential when they had the advantage, and instead were always going only so far to where they thought now the other side will come to the table. Now we'll be able to make a deal, when they didn't seem to want to realize they were dealing with ideological maniacs who don't understand any deals and have no intention of ever keeping them. I mean, we saw that, for example, with the recent comments from Angela Merkel and others, that the whole Minsk II agreement was simply a ruse to call off the dogs from the Russian side while they built up the Ukrainian forces. And I do have to say that aside from the fact that the Serbs in the 1990s were in a comparably weaker position than the Russians are today, I do have to say that the Russians do seem to exhibit a certain degree of naivete when it comes to their Western opponents, that somehow they think they're dealing with decent or rational people, when in fact they're not. They're dealing with people who on just an ordinary human level are simply, how do I put this, mentally, spiritually, morally sick people who simply have no ability to look at broader, reasonable interests of all sides to try to find a reasonable solution and stick to it. And one of my worries is still that there's that naivete may still exist to some extent on the Russian side, that they may believe that if they, give the Ukrainians a really bloody nose now, and the other side says, oh, let's have a truce now, let's have a negotiation, will they fall for that? Because I think, as much as I want to see the dying stop and the killing stop, I think in some sense, a blowing the whistle on this and a timeout, it would simply be used as another trick by the Western powers to say, okay, fine, let's give the Ukrainians some breathing space while we pump in a lot more military equipment under the guise of a peace negotiation. And then when the advantage shifts, we'll then really let them have it. But that's the only thing it seems to me the Russians could expect. And I don't think that's going to be in anybody's interest, not in the Ukrainians' interest either. It just means a bigger and more devastating war sometime in the future. I think if the Russians finish this decisively, hopefully with minimal loss of life, that would be the best thing for everybody. But, again, there's so many variables here. That's the trouble.
Yeah, I think in the West, unlike in Russia, you've got President Putin, who makes the final decision on what is going to happen. I'm not sure in the West that we have a central organizing intellect that says, okay, rationally speaking, we should take the following moves. We have certain objectives. This is what we will do. It's almost this swirl and tangle of people, everybody listening to everyone else's propaganda, and everybody sort of like the lemmings charging towards the edge of the cliff, determined that as long as everybody else is going, everything's going to be okay. And we see that with some of the toying around with the notion of employing tactical nuclear weapons, the early attempts to set off a dirty bomb that could be blamed on Russia and provide an even greater pretext for war. It's a chaotic situation which is enormously dangerous in terms of the risk of nuclear war, which of course would mean the virtual end of civilization. And yet all of these people simply saying, well, so-and-so says this would be okay. The boys in Davos seem to be in agreement that we can do this and we can indefinitely get away with it. I remember back, now this goes all the way back to December of 2021, Republican Senator Roger Wiker, very, very senior member of I believe the Senate, yes, second ranking Republican on Senate Armed Services Committee. And he said that we should not rule out attacking Russia with nukes and ground troops. And said military action could mean that we stand off with our ships in the Black Sea and we rain destruction on Russian military capability. I would not rule out American troops on the ground. We don't rule out first use nuclear action. In other words, what Senator Wiker was saying, and there was not some big backlash about it, but he was saying we shouldn't count out the notion that we could launch a nuclear Pearl Harbor and rain down hydrogen bombs on St. Petersburg, Moscow, and have young mothers strolling their baby strollers look up in the sky and see some tiny dark object falling the instant before the nuclear detonation goes off. And so it's a time of relative insanity that we live in. But it seems that for now, the people against nuclear war are in the ascendancy. Hopefully that has been moved to the back burner. But we're in this great debate that seems to be going on in Europe over the tanks. The Brits have said they're going to provide Challenger tanks, 10 or so. And the big struggle seems to be over the Leopard 2 tanks, which are produced by Germany and used by a number of NATO countries. What do you think of the debate that's going there over the heavy armor for Ukraine?
Well, from everything I've seen, first off, I'm surprised the Germans have held out this long in terms of the pressure being exerted on them, because they are such weak-kneed characters. I mean, they took the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines in stride, even though it was a direct assault on their economic interests. And I don't think there's a real mystery about which side did that. And so the Germans seem to have an almost endless propensity for masochism when it comes to the destruction of their own country's interests by their so-called friends. I expect them to crumble on that resistance sooner or later, but I'm surprised they've held out this long. I think the bigger problem with the talk of this armor being sent there, which again won't arrive for months, with the necessity of refurbishing a lot of this equipment, of training the crews and so forth, is that it's just another step for NATO to get a little bit pregnant in terms of our involvement in this war. That's the bigger problem. It seems to me that we're just escalating, continue to escalate the directness of our involvement in what up till now has been a proxy war. For example, we don't know exactly how many thousand NATO personnel under various guises already fighting in the war. Apparently, there are several thousand Polish troops already fighting there. There's been talk, for example, I guess there are American units, there's the 101st Airborne, I think, in both Poland and elements in Romania as well, talk about, well, maybe they might try to have a coalition of the willing, not necessarily a NATO force, advance into Lvov from Poland or into Odessa from Romania, which would then have to, by the way, go through Moldova, what presents a whole nother problem there. And a lot of people have looked at that and said, well, that's not militarily feasible. They couldn't actually fight their way into those places. There may be people who are foolish enough to think, based on Russian restraints so far, that they could do some kind of soft insertion where they just put them in there and then dare the Russians to attack them. And maybe they think they could get away with that. And to tell the truth, given Russian risk aversion, maybe the Russians wouldn't attack them, and that really sets the stage for something that could result in a direct clash and then an escalation. I agree with you. I hope that the dominant position in Washington, and which is really the only capital that matters, is that they are not crazy enough to go down the road mapped by Senator Wicker and others who say, oh, so first strike or direct American involvement. I hope that's the case. But you're right, too. I think that there is no real center of decision making. Certainly not, that husk of Joe Biden that's in the Oval Office that looks like they're trying to find somebody to get rid of anyway at the moment. It seems to me that the only one who has even a glimmer of appreciation of how serious this is William Burns, the CIA director and former ambassador to Moscow, who issued that famous "Niet means Niet" memo, I think 2007 it was, maybe 2008, somewhere in there, saying that the Russians have red lines and they have to be taken seriously. And obviously nobody heeded that advice. He was the point man they sent there just before the war broke out to say exactly what, I don't know. He was not, you can send a good messenger, but if you have a bad message, that's not going to change anything. And I think that still continues to be the case. It seems that we have so much in the Western establishment is not any clear set of strategic thinking, but rather a bunch of bureaucratic impulses that sort of bubble their way to the top as policy. Well, we're going to bleed the Russians white. Oh, we're going to make this a war very costly for them. Yeah, we've got them right where they want us. And I don't know there's any way to change that. There's simply nobody with the strength of character or intellect who could say, all right, we're blowing the whistle on this thing. We've got to shift gears and find some way out of this mess. I don't, we keep hearing talk about, well, should we give the Russians an off-ramp? I don't think it's the Russians who need an off-ramp at this point. It's the West, led by a bunch of intellectual midgets. And I don't see any way that that's going to change. That's what worries me.
With all the discussion about weapons, Ukraine has to get all of this stuff. The thing that all of this overlooks is that it's not just weapons that are at issue. It is the manpower to fight the war. Now, back several weeks ago, there was the head of the European Commission sort of let the cat out of the bag, said that there have been 100,000 Ukrainians killed so far in the war. This was a pretty credible number at that point because it was backed up by studies based on cemetery burials, local newspaper obituaries, and that kind of thing, that came up with a hard number of 102,000. Then later on, there was a leak of a very massive Ukrainian internal document that showed that there are 35,000 Ukrainian soldiers missing in action. Now, typically, missing in action means dead. There are exceptions. There sometimes are guys who slip out. So, out of the 35,000, who knows, there might be 2 or 3,000 who actually are living. Maybe some of them are deserters who ran off and they're missing. So maybe even 5,000. But you're talking about a massive number of missing in action who are, for the most part, dead. And this really was before most of the deaths occurred in Bakhmut, where Zelensky has simply sent wave after wave after wave of men to hold the line in Bakhmut. The Wagner forces certainly have lost a lot of casualties, but not nearly as in nearly the foolhardy fashion that the Ukrainians have, because they've used their advantage in artillery and their standoff ability and just pummeled the Ukrainians. So what we've seen ever since this inadvertent release by the head of the European Commission of 100,000, we've seen all kinds of wild claims about Russian casualties, saying, oh, well, they've got this many and that many. Oh, it's way more. And it's all rubbish. I mean, it just, I don't have a good grip on what the casualties are among the Russian troops, but my sensing is that it's substantially fewer than the Ukrainian casualties, could be a third. My guess is as good as anybody's, I suppose, but by this time, it's possible that we may have 150,000 Ukrainian casualties. And when they announced a week or two ago that they were going to enter into another phase of mobilization draft within Ukraine, the individual making the announcement said, now don't panic. Well, the Ukrainians are panicking because, you've got families that have, maybe they had 4 sons and they've lost 3 in battle and they have 1 left, or situations like that. And they're saying, my gosh, we're going to have no family with nothing. And so I think we're approaching the point where Ukraine is going to run out of manpower, no matter how many tanks, no matter how many guns they have. They just will not have the manpower. And there is no sign that Russia is doing anything other than multiplying its forces along the front lines.
That's correct. And, again, we can't be sure about this, but from all the indications I've seen, it looks to me like the Russians are losing somewhere between 100 or 200 a week, which is, nothing to sneeze at. I mean, that's bad. That's kind of the thing we saw during various times during the Vietnam War with American forces. But it looks like the Ukrainians are losing that like every day. And that the attrition rate is just so completely lopsided. And you wonder, one of the things that has kind of puzzled me in this war is the ability for Kiev to send soldiers into the, hate to use the expression, meat grinder, and they docilely, meekly go to their deaths. And you wonder at what point some of these guys start figuring that their best chance of survival is to shoot their officers instead. And that this thing starts turning it into a mutiny. There have been scattered reports like that, or it's also a lot more talk of surrender. I got a report earlier today that in this northern thrust in Zaporozhye, that this was just weakly defended territorial defense, and these guys just threw down their guns and ran. Especially since if they're local, that means they're basically Russian speakers who probably don't want to be in Ukraine anymore anyway, and they're certainly not going to die for the Kiev regime. So, there are, again, more moving parts to this as well. But you really wonder at what point let's say the strength of the human materials on the Ukrainian side finally just collapses. That they just don't have any more men they can throw in there, and how many more foreign fighters are going to want to go in there. You talk about the Wagner group. There was this so-called Mozart group that was sent in by Western mercenaries, and as I understand it, they've decided that it's not worth it anymore. They pulled out. So I think the signs that this thing is going to crack at some point in the fairly near future are beginning to come into place. I just don't know then what that means then. Once the propaganda narrative that, Kiev is winning finally has cracked, what happens after that? And then what do these numbskulls in Washington and London and Warsaw decide they have to do next?
Yeah. One of the things that it is such a shame that the narrative has been so wildly distorted in the West. If you look at it, when the U.S. overthrew the legitimate, duly elected government of Yanukovych in 2014, it did so with an extraordinarily violent revolution. We had people from our State Department selecting the ministers of the new government even before the old government had been driven out, and then very, very quickly the new revolutionary junta enacted a change to the Constitution that removed Russian as one of the two official languages of Ukraine. They had as their first language Ukrainian, as their second language Russian. I've seen different reports, anywhere from a third to 40% of the people in Ukraine spoke Russian. But when you look at it, the people who declared their independence, people in the Donbass republics and people in Crimea, they were doing so largely because they were Russians and they spoke Russian. Their culture was Russian. Their history was Russian in every respect, except for the historical anomaly of the lines drawn during the Cold War. They were Russians. And so they were fine. They were content with remaining part of Ukraine until suddenly they were declared hated second-class citizens by the revolutionary junta that was installed under the Obama White House during those years, those very bloodthirsty years of Barack Obama, the man who got the Nobel Peace Prize for what turned out to be slaughtering people all over the globe. But Americans don't realize that the people being fought over, it's a question of Ukraine trying to block self-determination for Russian people on their border who consider themselves Russians. They are Russians, and they are right on the border with Russia. I read this morning that the Gallup polling organization had done a poll to determine the public sentiment in Crimea. And this is before the overthrow of the Ukrainian government. And they were rather shocked to discover that over 90% of Crimeans wanted to be part of Russia. That's because they are Russians. They've been Russians for many centuries. And so Americans don't recognize that it is Ukraine trying to force Russians to become part of Ukraine, forcing them back into the Ukrainian state. And there's a great deal of misunderstanding in the American public about what the war was caused by and what it's all about.
Um, well, you talked about the overthrow of Yanukovych. I remember watching the news footage of the mostly peaceful protests against Yanukovych, where you had people with clubs and Molotov cocktails and chains attacking the police, and the news media saying, "We see here the police repressing peaceful protesters." And I remember seeing once one of the Berkut policemen being carried away on a stretcher minus his head. I don't know how you lose your head against a mostly peaceful protest, but that's the kind of thing we were seeing there. It's interesting that you talk about the language, Russian and all that, that the former spokesperson for Zelensky, Arestovich, gave an interview a while back, not that long ago, where he talked about how Kiev, tried to impose on the Russian speakers on the East an identity that was alien to them. You can't be speaking your mother's language that you learned as a child growing up, and if you don't like it, you can go to Russia. And he says, well, or maybe Russia will come to them. So who's stupid now? So I think that's something to keep in mind. It also, fits into a very complicated question of what exactly Ukrainian means. I mean, one of the problems with this Deus ex machina Ukrainian state that appeared out of nowhere in 1991, because there never had been an independent Ukrainian state before that, is that people within Ukraine, not only just Russian-speaking areas, but Ukrainian-speaking areas, had no consensus on what Ukraine was or who Ukrainians were or what Ukraine was supposed to be. And they attempted to foist on not only the Russian-speaking areas, but all of Ukraine, even Ukrainian-speaking areas like Chernigov and Zhytomyr and places like this far west Banderist ideology from areas that were part of the Austrian Empire or after that Poland, and had a very different sense of what Ukraine was supposed to be. Because if you look at Ukraine before the revolution, Ukrainians, I don't mean Russian speakers, Ukrainians were the most patriotic Russians in the whole Russian Empire. It was they were considered Russians in the same sense that Saxons and Bavarians and Prussians are all Germans, but they have their own local languages, their own local history and identity, but they're all Germans. And the same thing was true of Russians, Belarusians, people from various regions in these areas. It was only really during the Soviet period, and then during World War II and the whole Banderist presence during that time, that you had these different strains of Ukrainian identity. And I think what we're seeing now is, and this is something Putin said before the war the war began, that if Ukraine wants to be an independent and prosperous state and be a friend with Russia, have a positive relationship, sort of like Austria does with Germany or Canada does with the United States, that's entirely possible. But if it insists on being Russia's enemy and anti-Russia, that will call Ukrainian statehood itself into question. And I think we're seeing that now. I'm not sure there will be a Ukrainian state at the end of this thing. Let's remember that what you said about what this Kiev regime was doing to Russians in East Ukraine, Russia is not doing that to Ukrainian speakers. If you look at Crimea, for example, among the official languages besides Russian is Ukrainian and Tatar. So I don't know what the final end game will look like here, but I think it will be probably a little more open-minded and more respectful of local identities, languages, history, culture, and tradition than what we've saw from this. I think this term neo-Nazi has been overused, but I would say certainly Banderist ideological regime from Kiev, which has got really very limited roots in Ukraine, and not just in Russian-speaking areas, even in Ukrainian-speaking areas.
Well, Jim, we really appreciate your insights on this. I think we're at a point where we don't precisely know, but we can certainly see the storm clouds gathering across the battlefields of Ukraine, and I suspect we'll see some dramatic developments over perhaps the next month. But in any event, this gives us some good insight into where we stand and where we're headed. So with that, we will sign off. This is Senator Dick Black, and we've been proud to have our friend Jim Jatras with us today. We will see you at 11 o'clock on Wednesday for Focus on the News.